I mean, the normal person thing to do is just say thank you, but like when people are really complimenting you, it feels like thank you isn't enough, but I don't know what to do other than that.
Like I cringe up when I say thank you. It's like, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Like you've told me 100 times, but thank you.
Yeah, it's like, can I appreciate this a lot, but can I leave now?
Yeah,
Well,
you guys are weirdos. No, when someone compliments me, I'm just like, yeah, I know I'm awesome.
Yeah, no. We'll take this advice from perfectly adjusted Nicholas Millat.
No, and also like if you ever like back in the day on dating sites like OkCupid, there's like this one question and says, "Are you smarter than any other person? Like more, like are you smarter than most?" And the question is yes or no. Like people will always opt for no because modesty is the best policy. But like you can say like, hell yeah, I am. And then you like explain at the bottom. Remember that happened to me once. Like, are you smarter than most people? And I kind of said, yeah. And I just said like, because you can put the explanation under too. And I said, people keep telling me this all the damn time.
I mean, at that point, you'd be disrespectful to not say that you're smarter than everyone else.
It's like, yes, but I have good reason to say yes. Not like some egomaniac.
No, just goddamn it, take the fucking compliment, be happy, and someone thought you were awesome for once. Who cares if you feel a little weird afterwards?
I guess it's like society's like conditioning for us to be modest, like not like arrogant. I
guess, but hey, wait, something's weird here.
What?
You guys are here in person.
We're here in person?
No, really. Guys, this is a glorious day.
It is very nice to be able to stare into everyone's beautiful eyes, especially Cameron's.
Stop giving me compliments, David.
Just because nobody can see us. We're here at David's place, and of course David is dressed like he does at home, lounging. It's comfortable. I'm wearing my normal shirt and shorts. Cameron, on the other hand, like big occasion here. Nice pressed jean pants and a nice button-up shirt that has a tasteful top unbuttoning.
His hair tastefully coiffed.
Yeah, it's just great. He just looks great and put the rest of us to shame.
This is an amazing moment. Like I have, like if I'm on a podcast record with all y'all, I gotta be in the zone. And I'm very much like a look good, feel good kind of guy. So if I know if I'm looking good, I'm feeling good, like I looked after myself, I'm ready to go. I'm a method podcaster.
You're going to be the Daniel Day-Lewis of podcasts someday.
Oh, yeah, I will. Like Phantom Thread, Daniel Day-Lewis.
By the way, for anyone who listened to our Lincoln episode, and you know who you are, I made a prediction that baseball would not come back in 2020, and quite literally 24 hours after we finished recording that, baseball announced it was coming back. So from now on, you have the Nick Millat promise of no predictions on this podcast, except for when I say the Padres are finally going to win the World Series this year.
Yeah, okay, but you know what like pisses me off about that? Okay, Nick, you know about baseball and you were wrong. You don't know anything about MMA whatsoever. I've been training combat sports for over a decade. I watch and even sometimes write MMA breakdowns. There are not much people who are more qualified to like analyze it other than like actual fighters and coaches than I am. And you make predictions against me and you're always right, and I fucking hate it. I hate it so much. And then you're making predictions about baseball which you know about and you're always wrong. I don't understand.
A broken clock's right twice a day.
Here's all we can do. You have to understand. You've just been denying the evidence for my greatness for far too long.
Nick. See, this is why Nick is the only person who knows how to take a compliment.
All right, boys, ready to get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome back to a Mouthful of History. I'm, as always, your host, Nicholas Millat. Joined with me in person, to my left, Cameron Millage. Right, actually.
Fuck Liverpool.
Yeah, fuck Liverpool. Fuck Tom Werner. Fuck the Fenway Sports Group. Fuck them all. They know what they did. And right across from me, David Hollingsworth.
Hey, everyone. A Mouthful of History's resident bad boy here, David Hollingsworth. What's good?
Why do you say fuck Liverpool too? This has to be unanimous.
Okay. I guess fuck Liverpool.
Yeah, that's
good
right.
Answer.
Fuck Liverpool.
Good man.
Right.
Good man.
Awesome.
He has no idea what we're talking about.
Absolutely not.
That's why it's easier to coerce him to saying fuck Liverpool.
I am very impressionable.
And congratulations to 2019, 2020 Premier League champions Liverpool.
This year is finally our year. I don't know how many European Cups we got or Premier League titles. We did it. And we're not going to stop talking about it until the rest of our days.
In the beginning, you sounded like that store owner in Frozen.
So a Scouser.
Yes.
All right. So, yeah, we're back in person. So that's why when you finally do hear this, it sounds a lot less electronic than our Skype ones.
Those were a bit of a bummer.
Yes, they were.
They were a train wreck and a half.
Which one of you wants to introduce the episode?
Cameron, do you want to introduce the episode?
So today we are going to talk about the other Vietnam War. What do I mean about the other Vietnam War?
I mean, there's a Vietnam War that's not American.
Yes, there is. In school, we're talking about the Vietnam War, obviously because we're Americans and we have no other business to do than talk about America. And we see Vietnam War as being a conflict from 1963, 1975,
Something
usually.
like that.
But the thing is, the U.S. was involved in Indochina for longer than that. There was a conflict I like to think most people know about just by the title, the French Indochina War. France was the first country in that Indochina area, that traditional European power that started controlling it. And the Vietnamese people had to fight back against the first colonial power. Ultimately, they were successful, and the French did pull out. We have to talk about this whole conflict in Indochina as a longer continuum of history, rather than just an American version of that.
Yeah, Vietnam as an entity has very rarely, actually, if I'm correct, right now is the longest sustained period where Vietnam has controlled Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has worked for like a world history class the last couple years, before Vietnam was just always getting invaded by like China and shit. So it's very rarely enjoyed full autonomy in as long as it's existed, basically.
Yeah, and then during World War II, it was briefly ran by the Japanese.
Yeah, which we'll get to, of course.
It was like China, Japan, France, the United States. Vietnam had no break, and even to an extent, like Indochina itself, Southeast Asia, like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And so what we're doing today is that we are examining the first half of post-World War II Vietnam. One of the biggest battles that I think most people don't know is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And that was the decisive battle against the Vietnamese and against the French. And so this battle helped pave way for the finalization of the Geneva Conference, basically setting the pieces up for America's involvement in Vietnam, like permanent involvement in Vietnam, like as the sole imperialist colonial power.
As part of America's
greater Cold War effort,
basically.
So we're going to divide this episode up in 3 parts. The first part we're going to talk about is why was France even in Indochina, the creation of the Communist Party, and World War II. Part 2, we're going to talk about Dien Bien Phu in and of itself and the beginnings of U.S. involvement in that. And then part 3, we're going to talk about the Geneva Conference, the significance of the conference, and why did the United States get so involved in this process? Because we can't just talk about the United States and its complete involvement in Vietnam as the official away team. Like, this is more of a 20 or 30 year involvement in Indochina. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to split this into 3 parts, and we hope you enjoy it.
All right. So as somebody who knows very little less than you guys anyway, I guess the first question that's important to ask is, how did France get a hold of Indochina?
So basically, France had already, of course, like most other European powers, participated in colonization of the Americas in the 1500s, 1600s back then. But pretty much by the defeat of Napoleon in the early 1800s, its first colonial empire had already fallen apart. But during the 1800s, there was also colonization of places in Asia and Africa by the European powers too. And so for France, that started with the 1830 invasion of Algeria. This was the beginning of French, again, colonization, imperialism, brutalization of the people of Asia and Africa. Vietnam was part of that.
And so this is kind of the beginning of what we consider the Second French Empire. So what we see is France trying to compete with England on a global scale in terms of business and territory, because France wanted to be like top dog still. Like, yeah, their old colonies might have been gone, but they were back trying to do even more than the beginning. So we see the French start to colonize Vietnam in as early as 1857 under Louis Napoleon.
Napoleon III.
The great Napoleon III, who modernized Paris.
Strange character, that guy, because he actually starts off as like a left reformer.
Really?
And gradually becomes a right-wing reactionary.
You see the revolutions of 1848. Napoleon III wanted to consolidate power, and so he takes the side of what means to be conservative. And so he wants to control, he wants land for France as well. And so he wants France to be a big player in the world stage. So we see Vietnam become colonized in 1857. We know about how China was colonized, right? Like, we see the spheres of influence. Each country has like a port it controlled, but China had some freedom in terms of like import, export, and other policies. So we see that same policy in Vietnam. So France like originally had just spheres of influence and what ports they can trade off of. The French had the same agreement as the English had in China. They established ports in Vietnam, and they got into the opium trade.
Yeah, and real quick, just to talk about the way colonization works, we kind of have this image sometimes of a European army just marching in, beating the locals and saying, okay, like, this is ours now. And that's not exactly wrong, but it is a little bit more complicated than that, because usually, even if the European powers do win in battle, it's usually not a complete rout. And so anytime there's a war that doesn't end unanimously, let's say, or just again, like overwhelmingly, like lopsidedly, the party who loses still has some ground to be like, okay, like we'll give you some concessions, but not everything. So a lot of colonization during this time, especially in Asia, involved Europe having an upper hand on these Asian powers, but not being able to like completely wipe them out. And so that's why they were able to get these footholds, but they didn't completely dominate the local peoples the way they did in the Americas, because in the Americas, the disease and just everything else, that entire history involved a bigger victory over the indigenous people of the Americas, again, particularly because of disease, than they were able to achieve in Africa and Asia.
So long story short, European countries started to want to wine and dine them.
Yeah, exactly.
Wanted to wine and dine them instead of just going outright and just been like,
It is so much easier to get what you want with just like, hey, we'll take 75%, you get 25%.
Exactly, a negotiation.
And you don't have to sacrifice men. Just everybody benefits, except for the locals. They don't benefit. But, like the people in charge, yeah, they benefit. The colonizers benefits, and that's about it.
Exactly, yeah. And there were like the Vietnamese landowners and like rich, a lot of them did benefit from colonization. But like you said, Nick, the average Vietnamese person did not.
Because we have this idea when a country colonizes, it's direct rule. No, this time it's indirect rule. So these wealthy Vietnamese landowners definitely had sway over the population with French oversight. It gave the guise that Vietnam was being controlled by itself, but really the French were slowly but surely gaining more and more influence over the country. And so opium, heroin, became a cash crop in Vietnam. And so they were making some big bucks. They were raking it in at the expense of exploiting labor, as any imperialist power does. By 1884, France takes over Vietnam, and they also form a protectorate over Tonkin, which is North Vietnam, and Annam, Central Vietnam, Laos, and what is now Cambodia. So together they constituted French Indochina. Obviously, there's more resources in Indochina and Southeast Asia than just heroin. So the French colonists, they used Indochina as a base to send tea, rubber, and rice back to France. But the thing is, it also forced the Vietnamese into backbreaking labor to meet the demands of the quotas they had to reach for amount of exporting these goods over to France. And so this is nothing new in history. Imperialist power takes over, exploit the population for resources, and take everything and give nothing back.
Exactly. Or at least give just as little as they can give before there is rebellion.
Yeah, exactly. There's no benefit to giving the locals anything, at least in the short term. In the long term, they might maybe rise up against you.
And that's a great transition.
We realized that the people had enough. Now we're going to segue into what happens as a result of people collectivizing. And so we're going to see a figure or for listeners, hear a figure that has been watching over Vietnamese history in public school education. David,
let's go. All right, so I'm gonna talk about Ho Chi Minh because he is the like leader of the nationalist movement, the liberation movement in Vietnam. But before I get into him, just I should say that there was resistance beyond just Ho Chi Minh. He was a leader, but anytime in history that there is a resistance movement, most of the people who fought for liberation are just never going to be named in a textbook.
Yeah.
And that's especially going to be true when you're talking about a population that is largely not literate.
Because history is all about these huge figures. Like what encompasses history as generally, America, George Washington, Rome, Julius Caesar. In Vietnam, it's Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah, I also think it helps as a part of we love stories as a society. Stories are just easier to digest when there's a protagonist and an antagonist. And if you can personify them in specific people, it helps digest things a lot easier.
I mean, at least no one says like, oh, you had to be there.
Yeah.
It's like, it's great that story's down the window then.
Exactly. And so, I'm going to right now kind of trace the origin story, the Ho Chi Minh begins story of everything that happened. But I just wanted to throw that little disclaimer there. Just, remember that like resistance to anything does involve like large scale collective action, but there are people that stand out, and tracing their stories, like Nick said, can be a sort of metaphor or a good case study for these bigger forces of history. So with that out of the way, Ho Chi Minh was born in the 1890s to a dad who was a Confucian scholar who was very pro-Vietnamese independence, because a lot of the scholar class, while relatively well off, still weren't part of the most elite of elite circles. And also just generally, like in history, when you have people who are more educated, they're generally going to side with more, idealistic things because they tend to be more open-minded and all that. But not always, right? Because there are very educated goons that are out there.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Generally speaking, educated people tend to be a little bit more idealistic than the other people that are in their comparable positions of being well off.
Like they're idealistic, or they go on to commit like heinous world crimes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're either going to be someone really idealistic, or you're going to be like John Bolton or Dick Cheney or something.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So anyway, in the 1910s, Ho Chi Minh traveled to France, the United States, and Britain, usually working as like a chef or a dishwasher, just generally some sort of kitchen staff person. And he's getting educated during this time, but he's not completing a full program at any one university. But he's basically learning about the world while also working these like humble jobs in different kitchens and stuff. Then, and during this time, he is learning more about Vietnamese history and other histories as well, and gaining this pro-independence sort of liberatory perspective on things. But he also has a big admiration for the United States. And it should be said at this time, this was when the United States was becoming a world power in the 1910s, but it didn't really, as far as the rest of the world saw it, act as an imperial power. Now, you could argue that it actually had with the Spanish-American War and a couple other things, and Panama. But to the rest of the world who didn't really pay attention to like Central America and the Caribbean, the United States was a world power that wasn't engaging in the same evils that Western Europe was.
Because they adopted that whole isolationist policy.
Exactly. And so...
By the way, side note real quick, I love that Ho Chi Minh's work was either lowly dishwasher or chef. So
right, just all up in the kitchen. Right? That guy knew how to work for a day's wage. So in the aftermath of World War I, Wilson, who before entering World War I said that he wouldn't enter World War I, he had this idealistic vision of not just the League of Nations, which would become the United Nations, but he also had this vision of self-determination in the aftermath of World War I. And his way of looking at it was like, okay, if we're gonna have this war and the entire world order is gonna be shaken up, we should use this as a time for self-determination. That was really his catchphrase, self-determination. The problem though, and this wasn't put out there by him, the problem though is that he meant this for Europe because Woodrow Wilson was a racist.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, it's a big debate among both historians and like the general public as to whether or not we can judge people by the standards of today, because then everyone in the past would be a racist. But Woodrow Wilson, just so we're clear, was a racist for the time period. Someone in the 1910s would call him a racist. He embraced the KKK. So just to kind of put that out there. And so when Woodrow Wilson was talking about self-determination, he meant for like Austria-Hungary.
In Liechtenstein.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like,
that's what he's
like
talking
Liechtenstein.
about. Yeah, he wasn't talking about places like Vietnam or other places in Asia or Africa or Latin America.
For the record, for our audience, if you can look up when Liechtenstein became a country, because I just said that out there as just something, kindly let us know.
Email us at amouthfulofhistory@gmail.com.
Slide into them DMs. Just tell us.
Yeah, we will welcome those DM slide-ins.
We won't correct ourselves, but we'll definitely listen to it.
We'll issue like a small statement the way newspapers do, like the little tiny corner of the page correction that like no one reads.
Correction. On our last broadcast, we said that Black Lives Matter was responsible for the murder of 17 people. It was actually 0 people. We're sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And so with this entire perception in the rest of the world that the United States cared about self-determination, in June 1919, when Ho Chi Minh was 28, and by the way, this is before his name was Ho Chi Minh, but that's a long story. Long story short, he had a lot of different names. This was before he was actually named Ho Chi Minh. He was a 28-year-old kitchen assistant. By then, he had already kind of become like a prominent person for Vietnamese liberation. And so he helped present the claims of the people of Annam at the post-World War I Versailles Peace Conference. And this document that he presented was actually inspired by U.S. rhetoric, since the U.S. was viewed as a world power without imperial ambitions. He presented it to Wilson in the United States, but he never got a response. This actually wasn't unique to Ho Chi Minh. This happened to delegates from India, from Korea, from China, from Egypt, a bunch of different places.
I wonder why.
Yeah, and so because of that, Ho Chi Minh, along with many of these other liberation movements, started turning more toward Marxism and even Marxist-Leninism as opposed to the United States as a model for liberation.
It is amazing to me looking at like the early 20th century and what would become, especially during the Cold War, how many problems the U.S. could have prevented if they had just listened.
Yeah.
I say this as somebody who considers himself a socialist and generally actually kind of agrees with a lot of Marxist theory, but if they wanted to avoid all of the conflict they had, they could have just listened, but they ended up creating most of their problems.
When the United States talks about democracy, it's just protecting their own interest. America spouts this idea of like, oh yeah, spread democracy. Really, nah.
Yeah, and
they don't really care about other countries' freedoms.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that more in a moment. But yeah, going off of what Nick was saying, if after World War I, for example, the United States had actually lent an ear to a lot of these anti-colonial movements as opposed to just ignoring them, then there's a very real chance they, or at least some of them, would not have turned toward Marxist-Leninism and could have been within a friendly sphere with the United States. So, you know, that is definitely a very interesting what if question.
Because the U.S. adopted the whole isolationist policy like around this time, but we all knew they wanted to be in the game.
Yeah, and they were still engaging in like certain treaties, and they were definitely not isolationist in Central America and the Caribbean. But that's a
course.
A podcast for a different day.
Big man Monroe Doctor.
Then they were in just before they entered World War II. They were like, oh yeah, we're neutral, but we're also going to give the British all the help we can give.
Exactly. Politics is complicated, y'all. But anyways, all that what if questioning aside, this is what happened. And so in the 1920s, Ho Chi Minh became involved in French communist politics. He was actually a founding member of the French Communist Party. And then he went to the Soviet Union and just a bunch of other places. And again, you know, just very much broadening and globalizing his view. And during this time, you know, really looking at everything through an increasingly like Marxist way. Although, must be said, and again, something we'll touch on a little bit more in a bit, he still had a soft spot in his heart for the United States. And even after the failure of Wilson to listen to him, this would not be the last overture that he made toward the United States.
Because the United States, you know, with the Declaration of Independence, said freedom for like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a lot of these countries that were colonized, they wanted that. They wanted that piece of the pie. So they see the United States espousing that. And they're thinking, we want that too.
The United States grew from a colonial entity of England to break apart and become this powerful nation itself. It doesn't shock me that other countries would look at that and go, we can do that too.
Yeah, exactly.
And so with cosmopolitan Ho Chi Minh traveling around the world, getting ideas, becoming more socialist, Marxist-Leninist, we see political traction happen in Vietnam. And so for our Vietnamese listeners, I don't want to butcher names, but probably will. So forgive me. And in the spring of 1930, Nguyen Ai Quoc, he founded the Communist Party of Vietnam. But the thing is, there are...
Wait, we should say that is Ho Chi Minh.
That's Ho Chi Minh's real name, right?
No, that actually means...
It's an alias.
Yeah, that's actually
like 20 names.
Win the Patriot is what that translates to. Because, Win is one of the most common last names. So it's almost like if in the United States someone called themselves Johnson the Patriot or Smith the Patriot or something.
Because I didn't know that. I thought Ho Chi Minh was his just real name. Well, actually, no, I may have heard like his name is something else before, but it's been a long time since I hadn't.
None of the the major communist leaders used their act. Like they came up with like Stalin.
Man of Steel.
Lenin was not his actual.
Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
You know what the communists should have done is create their own version of the Wu-Tang Clan. Because every member of the Wu-Tang Clan has like 20 different nicknames.
Oh yeah, ODB, man.
Yeah, and like ODB, like some of his nicknames were like Old Dirt McGurk, and like I can't remember the other ones right now, but like he had like 20 nicknames, just like every Wu-Tang Clan member.
In fact, the only one I think who stuck with it, they're using their names, is the Kim family.
Huh, interesting.
I think they're the only ones. I don't know if... No, because Mao has different names too.
Well, it was Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. So that...
Those are their names. Like, they're the only communist leaders I can think of off the top of my head who use their names.
That's crazy. And they're like arguably some of the most authoritarian. So I guess the lesson is if you're going to become a communist, then change your name. Although Stalin was Stalin. So.
That's because the Kim family weren't really like idealists in the same sense like Lenin or even Ho Chi Minh were.
Fair.
Or an inferiority complex, Or as the name just didn't sound good as a leader, like Ilyich Ulyanov. Not a good name for a leader, right?
And then Lenin, that's a Lenin name right there.
You know, good old John Lennon. Imagine. So Ho Chi Minh, he forms the Communist Party in Vietnam. And so he wanted political representation for the Vietnamese people. So with the Communist Party creation, here were his basic tenets of the Communist Party. 1, kick the French out of Vietnam and Indochina. The right to the basic ideas of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Exercising workers' basic rights, abandoning taxes, allocating farmland for peasants, aka land reform, work 8 hours a day, as we have now in the United States, even though 8 still is a lot, though. it's still a lot.
6-hour work weeks, 30-hour work weeks, that's the way to go.
Let's go.
Practicing freedom of association, like the First Amendment in the United States, achieving gender equality, and providing universal education. So that's a solid platform and solid tenets, if you ask me.
Yeah, we're still trying to work a lot of that shit out ourselves. So
I know, right?
Oh, yeah.
But the Marxists, they were the bad guys.
And so we see the creation of the Communist Party, but then World War II rolls around. And Japan, with their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, i.e., we're going to take over the entire Pacific, decides to invade Vietnam. And so Ho Chi Minh, responding to this, creates the Viet Minh. You're going to hear this name many times. So the Viet Minh were the army of Vietnam as a response to Japanese. So like any home team should do, they beat the Japanese using guerrilla tactics. You're the home team. You know the area. Do what works for you to defeat an invading country.
And it should be said, too, that they worked with the United States to help beat the Japanese. So they worked with the OSS, which was basically the precursor to the CIA that was created during World War II, the OSS, and then after was the CIA.
But for listeners, what does the OSS stand for?
Shit. Office of Strategic Services, I think. Hold on. Let's pause real quick.
All right. I want to get this our audience, whoever responds to that first gets Taco Bell.
I wouldn't wish that punishment on anyone.
Taco Bell's fine.
I like my Crunchwrap Supremes, my Chalupa Cravings boxes. Those are amazing.
And they're amongst some of the cheapest, and actually, just from a nutritional value standpoint, one of their healthier fast food options.
Oh,
damn,
yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Crazy. Okay, I was right. I should have known to never doubt myself. It is the Office of Strategic Services.
So our listeners, sorry, there
No
will be
Taco Bell for you.
opportunities for Taco Bell, just not
We should
in this
just-
episode.
One of these days, we should ask a question. It's like, if you can answer the question first and email us, you get to be a guest on the next podcast.
That'd be
Oh
great.
no, that'd be a good idea.
Anyway, so the Viet Minh worked with the OSS to defeat the Japanese. And so this again goes back to the fact that like we look at political labels and we think that they're very like super strictly defined. I think it's better to say that like the Viet Minh were guided generally by Marxist principles, but they were first and foremost an independence movement. Even though they were guided by Marxist principles, they still took some inspiration from the US and were more than happy to work with them.
Because they themselves broke off from a major European power.
Exactly.
So the Vietnamese defeat the Japanese, and right after, they give the big middle finger to France and say, "We are declaring independence from y'all. Good night."
Yep. And so they declare independence, their actual own country, for just a little tiny amount of time. And when Ho Chi Minh is declaring independence, he quotes the U.S. Constitution saying that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Quick correction, that's the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, shit. Did I say Constitution? Yeah, sorry. Declaration of Independence. And so when the French kind of showed these colonial ambitions again, the Vietnamese, they contacted President Truman and they said, our goal is full independence and full cooperation with the United States. So again, they weren't trying to just become the Soviet satellite at all. They wanted independence. They wanted to be guided by like Marxist principles for how they ran things, but they also wanted to work with the United States and be part of like democratic sphere.
It's worth noting that at the time, besides the whole being a colonial entity that broke off, the Soviet Union ran by Stalin was not the Soviet Union ran by Lenin.
Yes.
And,
Way different, yeah.
It's way different, as Stalin was more of a cult of personality, a more brutal dictatorship.
And using old school Photoshop.
And so it would make sense that even a country that would embrace Marxism would still want to turn to the United States for help before they ask for Soviet help. And that's actually why eventually, so the Soviets and the Chinese would have a split because of stuff like this.
Yep.
And so the French come back to Vietnam. They control what's known as South Vietnam. And then the Vietnamese and the French meet at Fontainebleau in France over negotiations for the future of Vietnam. The negotiations were at a stalemate. And so this is all about whether Vietnam is going to be an independent country or not. And the French obviously don't want that. And Uncle Ho, who was also his nickname, he was frustrated. And there was nothing done over the question of independence of Vietnam. And the French weren't going to give it up. And so for our American history enthusiasts, we all know what the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was. The blown up ship in North Vietnam. We don't know who blew it up, but most likely it was us.
Yeah, probably.
So there was a similar instance, but no ship blew up. But there is always something in North Vietnam with ships, or at least like Spanish-American War, a ship. Gulf of Tonkin, a ship. But there's another one before Gulf of Tonkin. It was the Haiphong incident. This took place on November 23rd, 1946, only a year and a few months after World War II. A French cruiser started to pound the city of Haiphong, killing 6,000 Vietnamese residents.
Jeez.
And so this led to the Battle of Hanoi, which kicked off what we know today as the French Indochina War.
And if you want to know more about that, come back next time.
All right, lads. Good stuff.
Yeah, come back next time and we'll tell you all about the French Indochina War.